Deciding to check on her husband while he was on a business trip, the wife dialed his number from a friend's phone. But a surprise awaited her, and not just one. The preparations on the day of the business trip at the Peterson household went as usual, a rushed breakfast, when all she wanted was coffee, a bit of fuss, tears, and a plea to return as soon as possible. Agatha zipped up her Lewis suitcase, trying not to pay attention to the trembling in her hands. Her husband's coldness in the morning, his hasty goodbye, the awkward touch on her hand, all of it pierced her heart like shards of suspicion. "It'll be fine, sweetheart," Lewis muttered, kissing her on the cheek. But his lips felt foreign to Agatha, cold. "Lewis," she began, her voice betraying her with a tremor, "please call more often, I'm really worried. And Mom's sick, you know that." He nodded in agreement and added, "Of course, but I have a lot of work. And these business trips, sometimes I even forget about my phone." Work or something else, a thought flashed through Agatha's mind, leaving behind a bitter trace of anxiety. Another week without calls, just short texts about his perpetual busyness. None of this seemed like the Lewis she knew. Her husband had always found time to call, sharing little details and telling her about his day. "Well, that's it, Agatha, I'm off," her husband said, already at the door, not even turning around to say goodbye. "Good luck." "Take care," she whispered. After seeing Lewis off, Agatha stood by the door for a long time, inhaling the faint scent of her husband's perfume until the elevator took him downstairs. The day passed in the usual flurry of secretary work at the office. When she tried calling Lewis in the evening, he didn't answer again. He didn't return the call, and by the next morning, he still hadn't. This, of course, upset her even more. Tears welled up at the corners of Agatha's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away with a handkerchief. She couldn't afford to fall apart now, to lose her head or give in to panic. She needed to figure out what was going on, but first, she had to calm down. And there was no better way to do that than talking to her friend, especially since today was her day off. Joan, her best friend, was someone she could share everything with, even the most intimate thoughts. Joan always knew how to listen, comfort, and find the right words. I could also try calling Lewis from Joan's phone. He doesn't know her number. Maybe he'll pick up? Agatha thought to herself. When Agatha reached Joan's cozy home, she felt her anxiety ease a little, giving way to the joy of their upcoming meeting. A delightful aroma hit her nose, a mix of spicy herbs and something sweet-tangy. The smell of crispy roasted chicken blended with the subtle scent of rosemary and garlic wafting from the kitchen. In the air, there was a sweet undertone of baking, completing the already idyllic scene. "Agatha, darling." Joan flung open the door and hugged her friend. "What happened? You look so pale." Come in, let's have some tea. I'm baking an apple cinnamon pie, and I've got apricots and honey with walnuts, simply delicious." The apartment smelled not only of apple pie, but also of something subtly oriental. Indeed, on the table was a gleaming tray with tempting pieces of apricot, each one looking like a tiny precious stone encased in amber honey. In the corner stood a vase with freshly cut chrysanthemums, their bright yellow color creating a pleasant contrast against the dark brown tones of the wooden furniture. Another scent lingered in the air, a faint aroma of fried onions and something spicy, enticing. Joan placed a cup of fragrant lemon and honey tea in front of her. "Well, tell me everything," the hostess pleaded, beginning to slice the pie onto plates. "I'm all ears, because you're just not yourself today." "Joan, I don't know what to think," Agatha hesitated. "Lewis left for a business trip, he's not replying to texts, not answering calls, it's so unlike him." "Maybe there's a problem with the connection or he's just really busy," Joan tried to reassure her, though a hint of worry could be heard in her voice. "I don't know," Agatha sighed, cautiously taking a piece of pie. "Lewis has changed so much lately, he's become withdrawn and distant." "What exactly is bothering you? Is there something more serious?" Joan looked at her friend seriously. "I don't know," Agatha sighed again. "I want to call him, but I'm afraid I'll hear something really bad. And he doesn't even answer the phone anyway." Well, maybe we should try from mine, Joan suggested, and Agatha nodded gratefully. Don't you think it might be a good idea to just go to him? Agatha took the phone and started dialing her husband's number, but, as she discovered shortly after, his number had already been entered. Among the contacts, she saw the name X next to Lewis's number. Agatha immediately felt a wave of heat rush over her. X? What was that supposed to mean? Could it be her Lewis and Joan? No, that couldn't be possible. For some reason, she immediately lost the urge to call. Joan, Agatha whispered with a trembling voice, what does this mean? Joan paled slightly. She took the phone, looked at the screen, and, shocked, said, Oh my God, I don't know. Explain, what does this mean? Agatha demanded, her voice filled with desperation. She felt the ground beneath her feet start to crumble. I bought this phone secondhand, her friend spoke quickly. In the subway underpass a week ago, there was a woman with a baby in her arms. She was selling things. I bought it really cheaply, and it looked almost new. But there's Lewis's number, and it says X. Agatha could no longer hold back her tears. What does that mean, Joan? I don't know, Agatha, I'm sorry. Joan almost cried. I don't understand why that number is there. Maybe it was left over from the previous owner of the phone, and I didn't check. The air in the apartment thickened, filled with the heavy scent of anxiety. What did they have before? Agatha whispered, sitting at the table. What do you think? Why is my husband's number connected to this woman? I don't know, Joan repeated, and there was real despair in her voice. Maybe they met somewhere, or maybe he lost his phone and this woman found it. But no, X means something else. Deep down, the friends both knew these were just pitiful attempts at comfort, lies masking the painful, naked truth. In the silence, broken only by Agatha's soft sobs, there was only the whisper of doubts and painful guesses. The phone lay silently on the table, a witness to the unspoken secret. The scent of the pie no longer brought any joy, and Agatha mentally scolded herself for having gone along with this risky attempt to call from her friend's phone. I have to find out the truth, Agatha whispered, wiping away her tears. And what are you going to do? Joan asked. I'll find this woman, Agatha said firmly, her eyes lighting up with a spark of hope mixed with desperation. I'll find her and get to the truth. I need to understand what's going on. Joan gently placed her hand on Agatha's. She didn't know what to say, but her support was priceless. In that moment, simple friendship mattered more than any words. I'll be here for you, no matter what happens, her friend whispered. Joan, Agatha asked softly, are you sure you don't remember anything else? Where exactly did you buy the phone? Where did I buy it? Joan thought for a moment, propping her chin up with her fist. It was pretty late in the evening. The woman was wearing a dark jacket. I remember she was red-haired, slim, with a child in her arms, a little one, about a year old, maybe a little more. Poor thing was crying. She looked so tired, completely worn out. The mother was standing a few meters away from a stall with flowers, yes, definitely there. And nothing else? Agatha clung to the faintest hope. No, her friend shook her head. The phone seemed completely new to me, and she was selling it for next to nothing. She was in a hurry. I didn't really pay much attention to the purchase. I just felt sorry for her, that's all. The baby was crying so much. Agatha stood up from the table. Sorry, but it looks like I need to find her. I have to, you understand? Agatha, maybe you shouldn't rush? What if it's just a coincidence? Joan tried to calm her. No, it's not a coincidence. I can feel it. Agatha no longer heard her friend. Her thoughts were completely consumed by the red-haired woman and her baby. She felt goosebumps on her skin, the fear of the unknown, and at the same time, hope that this search might finally clarify something for her. As Agatha walked toward the subway, her heart was pounding like crazy. Descending the steps, she was engulfed by the familiar noise and bustle of the underground passage. Crowds of people rushed past her, disorienting her. Agatha pictured the red-haired stranger, her slim figure, dark jacket, but in the gray stream of faces, she seemed so elusive. Red hair, a small child, a dark jacket, she whispered to herself, scrutinizing every woman she passed. Her eyes reflected both despair and hope. She felt trapped in a labyrinth where every passerby was either a key to the answer or a meaningless sign. 40 minutes passed, and there was still no result. Agatha was barely standing, but she refused to give up. Fatigue gave way to intense focus, and hope burned brighter. Finally, she thought she saw her, a red-haired woman, but there was no child. No, it wasn't her. Suddenly, Agatha noticed two burly men attacking a skinny young man dressed in tattered clothes. They were beating the vagrant with obvious malice, shoving and kicking him. Her instinct for self-preservation vanished instantly, replaced by a strong sense of justice and the need to protect the defenseless. She didn't scream. Instead, with an unusual burst of strength, Agatha resolutely stepped between the men and the young man. "Leave him alone," she shouted. The thugs stopped, stunned by the sudden interference. One of them growled, "Get out of here, this is none of your business." "Oh, yes it is, it's very much my business," Agatha replied, standing in front of the poor man. She couldn't explain her sudden bravery, it was only a sense of justice, fury, and concern that pushed her forward. The attackers, realizing the situation was taking an undesirable turn, hesitated and reluctantly stepped back. The young man, breathing heavily, sat down on the concrete floor and looked up at his savior with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. Agatha leaned over him. "Do you need help? Should I call the police?" "No, thank you. I'm Mark." "My name's Agatha," the woman replied, surprised by her own actions. "Honestly, I've never been this brave before." Mark looked at her in astonishment. "You just saved me from those thugs." "Well, it happened more instinctively than anything else," Agatha said, watching as Mark struggled to his feet and picked up his backpack. His clothes were rumpled, and his face bore marks of bruises and scratches. Mark smiled and began brushing off his clothes. He carried a strange, earthy scent, a mix of freshness and something else, as if he had been living in the forest for a long time. "Listen, how about we go to a nearby cafe, have some tea, and talk? And let's drop the formalities, okay?" Agatha suggested. "A cafe?" the young man asked hesitantly. "Yeah, I'd love to, but I'll cover it." "Come on, don't be shy," Agatha pressed, and Mark gave in. 5 minutes later, they were sitting at a table by the window in a cozy cafe. "How are you feeling? Are you okay?" Agatha asked, looking closely at the young man sitting across from her. He was slightly hunched over, wearing a cheap, worn sweater and a light windbreaker. Mark awkwardly gripped the cup in his hands. The cafe smelled pleasantly of warmth and care, a sharp contrast to the harsh reality he lived in. "I'm fine," the homeless man mumbled, looking down at his dirty hands. "I guess I'm used to it." "They really hurt you," Agatha said softly. "So, what exactly happened?" Mark sighed sadly, his gaze suddenly becoming distant. "I gather herbs and sell them at the market. The money isn't much, but it's enough for me. Today, they attacked me and took everything." "They?" Agatha clarified, watching his reaction. "Yeah, 2 of them. Thugs, I guess. Everyone calls them Dale and Brett," Mark replied. He paused for a moment, then, as if gathering his courage, continued, "I live on the edge of the woods in a small hut. It's nice there, just birds and the occasional small animals." Despite the young man's quiet and calm voice, it carried a hint of despair. Agatha could feel how hard it was for him and tried to support him in any way she could. "Mark, I'm sorry to ask, but have you by any chance seen a woman with a child? Red-haired, slim, with a baby about a year old." Mark thought for a moment, turning the cup in his hands. He stayed silent for a while, struggling to piece together his memories. "A woman with a child," he repeated quietly. Yeah, I think I saw her. Near the subway, I believe. Red hair, yes, slim, with a baby. It was definitely a woman with a child. I think her name is Kelly. I'm not entirely sure, though. She lives, I think, in the annex. The young herbalist's words gave Agatha hope. This random witness could be the key to unraveling the mystery and help her find the stranger who sold John her husband's phone. Agatha jotted everything down in her notebook. Every detail could prove to be important. Thank you, Mark, she said with a smile. You've helped me a lot. He smiled back, though his face still looked weary. After a brief pause, Agatha cautiously asked, "Could you show me the way to that house?" Mark hesitated. "I'm not sure, but if it's really important." "It's very important, Mark," Agatha said firmly. "You'd be helping me a lot." Mark nodded in agreement and set his empty cup aside. "All right, let's go. But I'll warn you, it's not close, and the place is pretty run down." Leaving the cafe, he led Agatha through unfamiliar streets that stretched toward the wooded area on the edge of town. It felt like stepping into another world as they walked along a path surrounded by lush greenery. Agatha listened closely to his story, gradually forgetting her worries about her husband. "I used to work as an orderly," Mark said, adjusting his worn-out backpack on his shoulder. "The shifts were tough, but the pay was decent. I lived with my wife, but then we got divorced. She won the apartment, and I was left without a home or money. Friends, some acquaintances, helped me out, supported me. So now I just make a living however I can." "I see. I work as a secretary," Agatha replied. "It's fine, I guess, but it's so dull, reports, paperwork, calls, day in and day out. And I barely have time to actually live. My husband's always away on business trips, one thing after another." Mark nodded and glanced involuntarily at his worn-out shoes. "I tried finding a job at first too, but it didn't work out. Then I realized I could gather herbs. I know a lot about useful plants. My grandmother taught me when I was a kid. I sell them and get by." For a while, they walked in silence. The quiet was broken only by the sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the singing of birds. Agatha glanced at Mark. His face, rough and worn by life, was filled with a hidden kindness. She also saw in him someone unfairly wronged by fate. At last, they arrived at an old, half-ruined house. It stood apart from the other buildings, lonely, abandoned. Mark pointed to it with his hand. "Kelly lives here. I don't know if she's the one you're looking for, but she matches your description. She rented this annex recently." Agatha felt a sudden surge of energy. She was finally close to uncovering the mystery that might forever change her life. She looked at Mark with gratitude. "Thank you, you've really helped me," Agatha said, her heart pounding with the anxiety that gripped her. Mark simply smiled modestly, shrugging his shoulders. What else could he say? He lived practically on the streets, gathering herbs, with no family or future. How had he sunk so low? Meanwhile, Agatha was thinking about something entirely different. Could Kelly really be living in such a wreck of a house? Judging by the fact that she had sold a phone, the woman was clearly in need of money. And with a small child to care for. Government assistance was helpful, of course, but circumstances could vary. Agatha stopped at the door, leaning her back against the cold wall. She took a deep breath, finally trying to imagine what might lie beyond that door. Mark, who had walked alongside her the whole time, seemed to sense her anxiety. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. "Yes," Agatha replied. "I have to do this." She pressed the handle, and the door opened with a quiet creak. Inside, it was dark and a bit untidy. Toys were scattered on the floor, and the air carried the scent of fresh milk. Agatha stepped inside, her gaze drawn to a baby cradle neatly placed in the corner of the room. Seeing a pitcher of milk on the table, she cautiously touched it. The milk was warm, which meant Kelly had left very recently. For a moment, an inexplicable tenderness washed over her. After all, it was a child. And yet, she had never managed to become a mother herself. One thing or another had always gotten in the way. Louis had always been fine with that. All he ever cared about was work. Children, in his view, might be the flowers of life, but he preferred them to bloom in someone else's garden. The joy she felt at the sight of the baby quickly gave way to anxiety when Agatha noticed a piece of paper lying nearby. Mark, following behind her, saw the note too. He bent down, picked it up, and quietly read the short message aloud. "I'm tired of life. Forgive me. We came from water, and to water we'll return." Mark shook his head. What does that even mean? Some kind of riddle? Why did she leave the child? Agatha frowned, and then it suddenly dawned on her. My God! She's going to drown herself! Agatha exclaimed, grabbing Mark by the shoulder. Let's go, quickly, we need to hurry. Wait, Mark said. Let's check on the baby first. Who knows what that crazy mother might have done? Agatha rushed to the cradle and saw a tiny boy with barely visible golden hair, peacefully sleeping inside. I'll go after her, Mark said, quickly assessing the situation. He ran toward the door. Wait! Agatha called out. I'm coming with you. Let me just close the door. Fortunately, the river wasn't far. Mark broke into a near sprint, fully aware that every second mattered. Finally, he spotted a woman ahead, the red-haired one, standing by the riverbank, her long hair blowing in the wind. She looked distraught, utterly consumed by grief. Kelly! Mark shouted as he saw her slowly stepping into the water. Agatha felt her heart clench with fear. Kelly, don't do this. Do you hear me? We can help you. But the woman seemed not to hear and resolutely waded into the water. First to her knees, then to her waist, and soon the water rose to her neck. Leave me alone, she shouted. I can't do this anymore. But Mark wouldn't accept her words. He suddenly lunged into the water as she took another step deeper. Stop, you fool, he yelled, diving in and grabbing her by the shoulders. Agatha was in shock, but at the same time, she felt the urgent need to act. Hold on, Mark, she cried out, watching as he struggled to lift Kelly to the surface to prevent her from going under. For a while, the drifter struggled against the current, appearing to be on the verge of passing out from sheer exhaustion. Despite this, Mark didn't give up and finally dragged the drowning woman to the shore, where Agatha rushed to help them. Kelly's eyes were closed, and her lips had turned blue from the cold. Pushing Mark aside gently, Agatha carefully turned the woman onto her side to let the water drain from her lungs. Kelly immediately began coughing violently, and when she finally opened her eyes, her face twisted with fear and confusion. I can't do this anymore, she said in a trembling voice. It's going to be okay, Agatha said, trying to calm her. Your son needs you, and we're here for you. David, he's not my son, he's my nephew, Kelly sobbed. He was born to my sister Sarah, my twin. She gave birth, and 3 days later, she died from complications. Agatha held her close. You still need to fight for him. He needs you. You can't abandon such a little one. Kelly closed her eyes and curled up on the ground, as if trying to shut out everything that was happening. I don't know how to go on, she finally said. I loved my sister, and her man left her when she was pregnant. He didn't even know we were twins. We can help you, Mark said, slightly breathless from exhaustion. I know how hard it is, and believe me, you have a chance. Agatha looked at her new acquaintance with gratitude. He had kept his composure. Together, they helped Kelly to her feet. At times, she babbled incoherently, lost in her thoughts. You have to care for David, Agatha told her as they stepped through the door. The little one needs you, your love. Kelly looked at the cradle, and tears streamed down her face. Don't think I wasn't aware of what I was doing, Kelly said. My neighbor stops by every day to help, brings milk, she has a cow. She was supposed to come today too, so she would have found David. A chill ran down Agatha's spine as she imagined what could have happened if they had been even a few minutes late. It would have been a tragedy. At that moment, she decided not to ask Kelly about the phone. It wasn't the right time. They had, after all, just pulled her back from the brink. What kind of conversation could that be? I didn't mean to, Kelly whispered, lowering her head. I'm just so tired, so unbearably tired. Everything has piled up all at once. When Mom passed away, my stepfather lost the apartment in one of his drunken fits. Tell me, Agatha said softly, placing a hand on the young woman's shoulder. Kelly looked at her guest, her face contorted with pain. Sarah, Kelly paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. She worked for a businessman, Louis Peterson. He was her boss, promised her a promotion, and then Sarah got pregnant by him. That scoundrel refused to marry her, kept feeding her empty promises and giving her false hope. Peterson? Louis? Are you sure you're not mistaken? Agatha asked, her voice trembling with concern. Kelly nodded, then covered her face with her hands. Despite the storm of emotions churning inside her, Agatha patiently waited. She sensed how crucial it was to let Kelly speak, to release all the pain she had been carrying for months, even years. 3 days after giving birth, Sarah developed peritonitis, Kelly continued, her voice barely audible. The doctors did everything they could, but my sister didn't make it. David, my nephew, was left all alone. I became his mother and aunt at the same time, but it turned out to be too hard for me. I needed help, but I was afraid that if I asked for it, David would be taken away and put into foster care. I understand, Agatha said softly, gently taking Kelly's hand. You were afraid no one would understand you and that you'd be left alone with all this grief? Yes, Kelly nodded, her tears flowing freely. I was afraid of everything. I didn't know how to go on living with him, with David. Sarah was like a part of me, my twin. We were one whole, and now I'm just an empty half. She fell silent, staring off into the distance, recalling memories buried deep within her. She was so bright, so cheerful, always dreaming of having a family and a home. And then she had David, but she didn't even get the chance to enjoy being a mother. The only thing left of her was her phone. I had to sell it out of desperation. Kelly covered her face with her hands and broke into sobs. Agatha pulled her close, gently stroking her hair. She understood that not everything could be expressed with words. Some things could only be shared heart to heart. Tell me about Louis Peterson, Agatha asked softly after Kelly had calmed down a little. Kelly slowly lifted her head. He was controlling and kind of cold. He didn't love Sarah, he used her and then just forgot about her. He found out about the pregnancy when she was already 3 months along. Louis offered her money and told her to have an abortion, but my sister refused. Sarah loved him and wanted to have his son. And after the birth, he didn't even call, didn't show up, nothing. He just disappeared, along with his money. Kelly fell silent. Agatha held her hand, feeling the tremor in her body. At that moment, she realized how much Kelly needed help, support, and love. Agatha decided to help her survive for David's sake and in memory of her sister. She glanced at Mark. He was sitting with his head bowed, a deep sadness etched on his face. Agatha approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Thank you, you saved Kelly's life. Mark looked up at her, his eyes filled with exhaustion and something else, perhaps hope, or maybe something even deeper. Agatha stayed with Kelly for a long time, listening to her story. She learned much about her late sister's life, her dreams, and her love for Louis. At the same time, Agatha came to a stark realization. Her husband was a cruel and heartless man who had betrayed not only his wife, but also the woman who had borne him a son. At that moment, Agatha felt unwell. A wave of lightheadedness swept over her, a result of the stress she had endured. After all, it's not every day you discover that your husband is not only unfaithful but a heartless philanderer. But there was one thing Agatha was absolutely certain of: she would no longer live with a cheater. After speaking with Mark outside, she asked him to stay with Kelly for the night to make sure she didn't do anything reckless again. She then said goodbye to the baby's foster mother, promising to visit again. As she left the house, she knew her life had changed forever, and it was time to accept that change and prepare for a divorce. Finally reaching the outskirts of the city, Agatha sat down on a bus with a sense of relief, hoping to pass the time more quickly. The soft glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement drew her into her memories. The bus swayed gently, its monotonous engine hummed, lulling her into the arms of the past. Suddenly, a scene from her childhood appeared in her mind: endless fields, her grandmother's cozy house in the village, the scent of freshly cut grass, and the sweet aroma of raspberry jam. Her grandmother, Lily, a kind-eyed woman whose hands could work wonders with the simplest ingredients, waited for Agatha every summer to spend the holidays together. Those days were filled with endless games with the neighborhood kids, and evenings were spent listening to her grandmother's stories about mythical forest spirits and kind house elves. The smell of freshly baked bread from the oven and the taste of tangy herbal forest tea were inseparable parts of her happy childhood. Nina, her mother, a strict schoolteacher of English language and literature, was always accompanied by her signature bun of graying hair and intellectual glasses in a thin frame. "Agatha, my dear, read more classics, it's the foundation of everything," she recalled her mother's voice. Memories surfaced of endless read-aloud sessions, music lessons, and evenings spent embroidering with her mother, during which Nina would share incredible stories about her own childhood. Her father, Gregory, a designer artist at the local cultural center, was constantly surrounded by canvases and the unique scent of oil paints. Gregory's imagination knew no bounds. He could spend hours describing the fantastical worlds he created. Agatha remembered his gentle hands, the care in his eyes, and his great sense of humor. It was her father who taught her to see beauty in the little things, the play of light and shadow, the details in each petal of a flower. His works, vivid illustrations for children's books, theater posters, and designs for greeting cards, were a feast for the eyes. Gregory amused his daughter by drawing caricatures of her teachers and livening up dull math lessons. Their evenings were spent sketching, discussing new ideas, and listening to classical music together. Her school years flew by like a whirlwind, sweeping away childhood dreams and first adolescent feelings. Agatha managed to do everything: excel in her studies, act in the school theater, write poetry for the school newspaper, and care for her ailing grandmother. She easily connected with her peers, but always remained a bit mysterious, harboring secret dreams. In her diary, Agatha described her feelings, her friends, and her teachers. Each day was filled with events that left their mark on her soul. Then came university, new acquaintances, and her first true love. Louis, a tall, broad-shouldered young man with a charming smile and a gaze that captivated her heart. He seemed perfect, confident, ambitious, and caring. Their romance was vivid and passionate, filled with emotion and tenderness. "Agatha, I love you. Will you marry me?" The memory of his proposal echoed in her mind. The wave of emotions, brought on by a sense of universal happiness, overwhelmed her. She said yes without a moment's hesitation. The wedding, the honeymoon, the first years of married life, it was all wonderful. Or at least, that's what she thought. Agatha made plans, dreamed of children, of their shared future, of a big, happy family. But the children never came, and over time, something seemed to go wrong. A jolt from the bus, which had stopped at her destination, pulled Agatha out of her troubling memories. She walked home, her steps slow and heavy, as if in slow motion. Deep down, Agatha was angry at herself for living in illusions and failing to notice the betrayal sooner, and angry at Louis for his deceit and cowardice. But most of all, she feared that she might not have the strength to follow through with the divorce. At home, in the emptiness of her apartment, Agatha pulled out an old notebook where she kept letters from Louis written many years ago. She reread his words of love, his promises, and vows. Sadly, each word now seemed tainted by betrayal. In the notebook, she found a pressed flower, a daisy, her favorite, the ones Louis always gave her on her birthday. The scent carried memories of a love that had long since turned to ashes. "At last, I see you for who you really are, Louis," Agatha whispered, clutching the dried flower in her hand. "And now you'll pay for your betrayal." And you'll answer for Sarah and her son, too. Late in the evening, just before bed, a devastated and desperate Agatha finally called her friend. Her voice was hoarse from tears and exhaustion. Agatha, calm down. Why are you crying? Maybe you're exaggerating, or that girl just made it all up. I mean, come on, twin sister? Honestly, it's hard to believe. No, Joan, it's true. Besides, I called my husband from your phone. I saw how Louis was saved in your contacts as X. Do you think that's a lie? Silence. Agatha could hear Joan sigh sadly. Well, my friend, I didn't want to upset you, but after hearing your story, I have to admit, I didn't think it would turn out to be this serious. Joan, my husband is cheating on me, and he's been doing it for a long time, right under my nose, in my own city. Agatha shouted into the phone, as if breaking the tense silence. My dear Agatha, I understand and feel for you, but please calm down, have some valerian tea. Joan's voice sounded calm, with that fake concern that irritated her so much right now. Calm down? Joan, I'm on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Well, you know, men are like that sometimes. Don't beat yourself up over it. You're young, attractive, you'll find someone better. Joan said this without a hint of empathy. Agatha's voice seemed to dissolve against the backdrop of her friend's indifference. Better? Joan, are you serious? This is 10 years of my life. 10 years of love, of trust. Agatha exclaimed in despair, gripping the phone tightly. Don't get so worked up. You know it's best to stay calm right now. Think about yourself, do something nice, take a bath, read a book. Tomorrow, it won't seem as bad. Joan's voice became even calmer, devoid of any emotion. Agatha fell silent. At first, there was a heavy silence on the line, followed by quiet sobbing, not desperate, but soft and soul-piercing. Joan, you didn't understand anything, Agatha whispered. I do understand. I just don't know what to say. Just try to get some sleep. Joan hung up, leaving Agatha alone with her pain. Why had Joan reacted like that to her news? Was it resentment? Disappointment? After washing her face with cold water in the bathroom, Agatha went to bed. Trying to call Louis didn't yield any results either. It was as if he had forgotten about her, as though he'd put her on a blacklist. Or maybe he was already having fun with another beauty. That wouldn't be surprising. He abandoned Sarah and her child, cheated on his wife. What else could you expect from such a despicable person? Anything was possible. The next morning, Agatha woke up with a heavy heart. Her mood was even worse than the day before. After drinking a strong cup of coffee, she decided to visit Kelly. Today, Agatha decided to take a taxi instead of public transport. The trip would cost more, of course, but it was much more comfortable. As the car approached the house, Agatha noticed Mark sitting on the porch from a distance. Good morning, she said, stepping out of the car. How's David? Hi, Mark replied. Not good. His temperature is high, he can't sleep, and he's crying. Kelly's really worried. Kelly met Agatha at the door. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red from crying. Little David was lying in the cradle, restlessly tossing and turning. He felt hot to the touch. Thank you for coming, Kelly whispered quietly. He has a high fever. I don't know what to do. All right, we'll call an ambulance right now, Agatha reassured her, pulling out her phone. Everything's going to be fine. Just try not to worry too much, or you'll drive yourself into a nervous breakdown. The paramedics, who arrived within minutes, quickly examined the baby. Viral infection, the doctor concluded. And it looks like he's teething as well. He needs to be hospitalized. Kelly fell into despair. But I don't have any money, she whispered. Agatha said firmly. Don't worry, I'll cover everything. Mark, blushing, added. I'll help too. I've saved up a little money from selling herbs. I can contribute. In the ambulance, Kelly held David in her arms, constantly stroking his tiny hand. Agatha looked at her with compassion, thinking about how unfair life could be. A young woman who had lost her sister now had to worry about her nephew. The children's ward of the hospital greeted them with noise, the smell of medicine, and an endless flow of people. Sounds of crying babies, the hum of machines, and the muffled voices of the medical staff filled the air. Agatha felt awkward and uncertain among the experienced mothers, who quickly found common ground, sharing advice and comforting one another. The rooms were small, with beds made up with simple white sheets. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectants and medicine. In one room, a child was crying. In another, a baby snored softly in their sleep. Mothers, immersed in their worries, whispered quietly to each other. David was placed in a separate room. Agatha and Kelly stayed close by. In the first few days, we'll be monitoring him constantly, the nurse explained. We'll take blood tests, check his temperature, and examine his throat. The main priority now is to reduce the fever and fight the infection. How long will David have to stay here? Kelly asked, her eyes filled with worry. A few days, maybe a week, the nurse replied. It all depends on how well the treatment goes. Agatha decided to stay at the hospital for a while, knowing how hard it would be for Kelly to handle everything on her own. She took care of organizational matters, requested a week off from work, and called Lewis, fully aware that he might not answer. Then she ordered food from a nearby cafeteria and bought clean swaddles and diapers. Mark brought herbal infusions that helped Kelly. The days at the hospital dragged on painfully slowly, procedures, medications, and medical checkups. During the night, Agatha and Kelly took turns sitting by David's crib, reading him stories, singing lullabies, or simply sitting quietly, touching his tiny hand. Mark felt out of place, but still came by every day, bringing flowers and helping however he could. On the 5th day, David's temperature stabilized. That's much better, said the young doctor, Steve, with a smile. Don't worry, Mom, the baby is going to be fine. A cold and teething are very typical for his age. Hearing such good news, Kelly burst into tears of happiness. Agatha hugged her, feeling a wave of tenderness and empathy bloom in her heart. They had barely known each other, yet they had already been through so much together. The attending physician, Steve, turned out to be not only a skilled professional but also a compassionate person. He patiently taught the women how to care for the baby, showing them how to hold him, swaddle him, and soothe his cries. To her surprise, Agatha noticed something quietly blossoming between Mark and Kelly, something more than just friendship. Mark was constantly by Kelly's side, helping her and looking at her with such tenderness that Agatha couldn't help but smile. Despite all the difficulties, Agatha found herself undergoing an unexpected transformation. She became fully immersed in caring for her nephew, discovering the wonderful world of tiny humans, sleepless nights, and boundless love. Agatha watched how Mark effortlessly overcame challenges, cared for Kelly, and supported her in every way. She realized this was a truly good man. Mark, you're amazing, Agatha said one day as they sat together in the hospital corridor, waiting for the next checkup. He blushed. Thank you. I think I've fallen in love and want to do everything I can to make Kelly and David happy. Agatha nodded, feeling her heart fill with an unusual sense of calm. She understood that her upcoming divorce from Lewis was just the beginning of a brighter, more authentic life. To her surprise, Joan hadn't called even once since their memorable phone conversation. In fact, she hadn't even taken the time to send a text. So much for women's friendship, about which so much has been said and written. Words are one thing, actions quite another. The day before David was discharged, Agatha met with the doctor again. You're doing very well with the baby, Steve said with a smile. You must have had some good practice? Thank you, Agatha replied, trying to hide her awkwardness. It's all thanks to you. Glad to be of help. Medicine is my life, Steve replied. As she left the doctor's office, Agatha couldn't help but reflect on her recent struggles and her search for the truth. She thought about everything that had happened and realized that Lewis wasn't worth her sorrow. He had turned out to be just another selfish man, undeserving of her love or care. That evening, while David was soundly asleep, Agatha and Kelly sat in the hospital room, quietly chatting. "You know, Agatha," Kelly said, "I always dreamed of having a family and children, but fate had other plans." "Don't worry, everything will work out," Agatha reassured her. "David will have a wonderful father, and you'll have a loving husband and a reliable friend in one person, Mark." Kelly smiled, and a spark of hope lit up in her eyes. Agatha felt that she wasn't just helping Kelly, she was helping herself, too. She had found a new purpose in life, to help others, to give them love and support. The day David was discharged from the hospital was a true celebration. Mark finally got to hold David in his arms, and together with Kelly, they set off into their new life. Watching the young couple, Agatha realized that she had found her place in the world. She promised Kelly and David to stay in touch and help them as much as she could. There was also one small detail warming her heart, something she hadn't even mentioned to Kelly or Mark. Steve had taken her phone number and promised to call soon. As Agatha understood it, the young doctor had gone through a painful divorce a year ago and was finally ready to open himself up to new relationships. However, the thought of returning home filled her with dread, as it meant potentially running into Lewis, who had likely returned from his business trip by now and found her note on the table informing him of the divorce. David's discharge from the clinic was one of the few bright spots for her in recent days. She walked home tired but happy, tightly clutching a small bouquet of flowers from Steve. Then, as she passed an empty lot littered with garbage and torn newspapers, she noticed a small puppy trembling from the cold. He was dirty, skinny, and his big, sad eyes touched something deep inside Agatha's soul. Without hesitation, she tucked him inside her coat and hurried home, forgetting about everything else. The soft, warm bundle pressed against her, calming the storm within her. The key turned in the lock. Agatha stepped into the apartment and froze in the doorway. The scene before her hit her like a bolt of lightning, leaving her stunned. Lewis, laughing, was holding Joan in his arms. She was wearing Agatha's robe, the very one Lewis had given her for Women's Day. Joan laughed in return, pressing herself against him. On the table were the remnants of an unfinished dinner, a romantic setup, and a partially burned candle. Agatha stood motionless, as if turned to stone, and the puppy, sensing his new owner's state, began trembling even more. "Lewis, Joan, what is the meaning of this?" Agatha's voice was quiet, almost inaudible. Lewis blushed and awkwardly cleared his throat. Joan flinched, and the confidence that had once lit up her eyes was now replaced with guilt and fear. "Agatha, explain what's going on." Lewis stammered. "There's nothing left to explain." "I've seen enough," his wife interrupted, her voice filled with bitterness. The tears she had been holding back all this time began streaming down her cheeks. "All right, Agatha," Joan whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt you. You can see how things turned out." "Didn't mean to?" Agatha shouted. "And how do you think I feel right now? You've both been deceiving me for so long. Joan, you were my best friend, and all this time, you were with him?" Saying this, she hugged the puppy tightly and walked out the door. Behind her, she could hear the indignant murmuring of her husband and Joan, but she didn't care anymore. Let it all go to hell. What a fitting ending, no other way to describe it. She had gone to Joan, shared her deepest secrets, cried on her shoulder like a fool. And all the while, her friend was cozying up in her husband's arms, thinking herself so clever. At that moment, she remembered Steve's phone number. As if to confirm her thoughts, the puppy nestled against her chest let out a hopeful little squeak. Struggling to gather her thoughts, Agatha shakily dialed the number. "Steve, we need help." Half an hour later, she was sitting in his cozy living room, holding the tiny puppy on her lap. Steve listened carefully to her shocking story, his gaze full of sympathy. "Don't worry, everything will be fine," Steve said, handing her a cup of hot tea. "You deserve better than what your husband gave you." "And Joan? Is that a friend?" "Just an acquaintance, really." She'll regret this, but it'll be too late by then. Then the doctor looked fondly at the puppy. What's this little one's name? He's so tiny. I'll admit, I've always dreamed of having a dog, but my mom was allergic. I haven't decided yet, Agatha replied softly. How about Lucky then? Steve suggested with a smile. I'm sure it won't be long before he becomes your loyal friend and protector. Agatha nodded in agreement and hugged the puppy close. Steve's home smelled of pine and something sweet, reminiscent of ginger. It was quiet and peaceful here, in stark contrast to Agatha's apartment, now taken over by her former friend Joan. Lucky quickly made himself at home, running around the spacious living room and barking joyfully. Don't worry, Steve said, stroking Lucky. We'll sort everything out, Agatha. You have every reason for a divorce, and we'll make sure justice is served. The next few weeks were filled with the agonizing wait for the court date. Joan's phone calls, full of threats and insults, gave Agatha no peace. You'll lose everything, Agatha. Louis is mine, and soon David will be with us too. Joan shouted into the phone. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed. Agatha sat, tightly holding Steve's hand, his presence providing her with some semblance of support. Louis, seated on a bench next to Joan, looked pale and confused. Agatha's lawyer, an experienced and composed man, conducted the case with confidence, presenting his arguments clearly and convincingly. He introduced indisputable evidence of Louis's infidelity, including photos from the late Sarah's social media and witness statements. Your Honor, the lawyer began, in this civil case, we are addressing the divorce between Agatha and Louis Peterson. The plaintiff is seeking the division of marital assets, including the apartment, vehicles, and all financial assets. Furthermore, we have provided evidence of the defendant's infidelity, which serves as grounds for awarding the plaintiff priority custody rights for the minor child. Louis's lawyer tried to refute the accusations, but his arguments sounded unconvincing. The judge listened attentively to both sides, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The trial was long and tense, with every word from the lawyers weighed carefully on the scales of justice. As is well known, marital property is considered joint property unless otherwise specified in a prenuptial agreement. In this case, no such agreement exists, and therefore, the court is obligated to divide the property equally between the parties. Regarding the custody of the minor child, the court prioritizes the child's best interests. Based on the evidence presented of the defendant's immoral behavior and infidelity, the court rules to grant custody of the child to the plaintiff, the judge announced in a booming, well-projected voice. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Agatha, barely holding back tears, looked at the judge with gratitude. Then came a bombshell. Agatha's lawyer presented additional documents proving Louis's paternity of the child born to the woman who had sold Joan the phone. The genetic testing left no doubt. Your Honor, the lawyer declared, as a result of an independent genetic test we conducted, it has been established that the defendant is the biological father of the minor child born out of wedlock. According to the current family law, he is obligated to pay child support. Louis turned even paler. His face was a mixture of shock and fear. Joan let out a cry and tried to lunge at Agatha, but the bailiffs quickly restrained her. After reviewing the case materials, the court rules as follows: Agatha Peterson and Louis Peterson are to be divorced, with their marital property divided equally. Custody of the child is granted to the plaintiff. The defendant is ordered to pay child support until the child reaches adulthood. The court's decision will take effect in 1 month unless an appeal is filed, the judge declared. Agatha felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, but her soul was filled with a sense of lightness and freedom. She had won and achieved justice. What truly frightened her unfaithful husband wasn't the division of property or even the child support, it was the stain on his reputation. In business circles, where moral standards were highly regarded, such a blemish was far more damaging than the loss of wealth or connections. Joan realized too late that, without the backing of influential allies, Louis had become just another failure destined for the bottom. Meanwhile, Agatha's life had taken a turn for the better. By her side now was the loving and dependable Steve, as well as their loyal companion, Lucky. Kelly and Mark were thriving too. Mark had even submitted a marriage application to the city hall. After discussing it with Agatha, Steve decided to combine the joyful occasion with practicality and convinced the staff to schedule their wedding ceremonies for the same day. After all, how could it be otherwise when his feelings for Agatha were no less deep than Mark's for his bride? Relationships that start with love and mutual respect naturally lead to happiness. And this simple truth was evident even to Lucky, whose cheerful barking accompanied the newlyweds all along the route of their wedding procession.